I'm bad at lines. Okay.
So I think we're ready to start talking about options, right?
Yes. And I'm going to actually ask Henry, if you're, since you drafted this, whether you could do the quick summary on each one.
Sure.
Oh, okay. Ahead of the game, but we did this as an exercise of a class at the University of Oregon, and it came up fairly quickly that if you can't meet goal number 1 or goal number 7, you're probably not a viable option.
So we'll start with 1 and 7 for each one?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. As we talk about the options, we have 11 here, and one important point is that these are pretty broad buckets. Each option is not really one option, but a category where we can tweak, exactly how we fund the system or exactly how we divide up responsibilities within that structure. So one of the things we should be discussing with each of the options is, if we went this direction, how would we make it work? What would be the most sensible arrangement within this type of option? I hope that we can have a good, frank discussion about each of these. And I think one of the goals today is to have folks lay their cards on the table and say, this is what Metro would really like, and this one is unacceptable to Metro, unless you can meet, say, criteria A, B, and C to make it acceptable to Metro, just as an example. So in the set of options, I tried to put everybody's sacred cow on the menu. And so there may be some you don't like, but we need to discuss them all. And at the end of the day, hopefully we'll have either ruled them out because they're unacceptable to some people at the table, or we'll have identified ways to make them acceptable to everyone at the table. So our 11 options are essentially the status quo, and we can talk about maybe making the status quo better, particularly in terms of funding. The second one is a new flood control agency created by IGA. This is what's known in California as a Joint Powers Authority, or in Oregon as a 190 agency. There aren't very many of them in Oregon, but it gives you tremendous flexibility. Essentially, any group of governmental jurisdictions can combine whatever powers they have and delegate those powers to a new agency. So whatever authorities you have, you can play around with them and build something new. The third option is to consolidate and probably expand the drainage districts to take in a larger tax base. I said consolidate and expand because I think if you're going to talk about expanding the boundaries, it would make the most sense to also consolidate so you don't have to worry about, SDIC expands this direction and MCDD expands this direction, but how do you define that new boundary between them? You don't want to create too many complexities around creating a lot of new boundaries. Then we have several options that are utility models, where you could create a municipal utility and charge usage fees as a utility does. That could be run by a drainage district. It could be run by a new special district, and there are various authorities under state law to create new special districts. It could be run by the cities through their stormwater utilities. It could be run by Multnomah County, like Clean Water Services in Washington County. And then we have some options that are basically handing over the task to an existing government, an existing agency, which could be Multnomah County, it could be Metro, it could be the Port of Portland. Perhaps somebody has another idea as well. And then finally, we have the option of creating something entirely new through the state legislature, as Louisiana did after Hurricane Katrina. And with that option, there's total flexibility. You can tailor your solution to the needs you have locally. But of course, there's also a heavy political lift.
And I just want to add, Jeff Condit came into the room right after we did our introductions. Jeff serves as our counsel for the drainage districts, but also has provided service to Levy Ready Columbia, coordinating the legal counsel for all the jurisdictions. So as questions arrive, if there are legal questions, I'd like to invite Jeff to raise his hand and give input too.
Not to muddy the water, but want to make sure that we're clear that when we're looking at these options, we're looking at options that can solve both the operations and the capital piece. Because another approach would be to have some sort of capital financing authority and separate it from the operating piece. I don't know if we want to go there, but I want to make sure that we're thinking about this as something that's integrated, doing both, or not.
Right, and I think that's a key question with several of these options. You know, just as an example, suppose you turned it over to Multnomah County, created a new service district akin to the library district. You could then try to decide, should this new agency just provide financing for capital, or should it also be in charge of operations and maintenance? How do you define and divide those responsibilities?
And I would say that it's not required that they be consolidated. There's a lot of advantages to consolidating them, but there's lots of models where they're not. That the skill set involved in evaluating flood risk management, raising funds, permitting, and constructing are different than the skills often involved in operation and maintenance. Doesn't mean they can't live together, but they don't have to.
I believe Ken's not hit on just a side issue, but maybe the core of the issue. Are they combined or are they separate? And I throw a third one in there. Maybe there's three elements, and the other one's surface water. Maybe there's three elements. Maybe there's a surface water solution. Maybe there's a capital, larger policy group, and then maybe there's an operation of the levy solution. So I would hope that we would
because A is money.
have that as a focus as we try to come up with what works best.
Yeah, earlier when I said that I wanted to do a few binary analyses, and I said there were three, the third was this issue. Right. Should we O&M be with capital or not? And I think you've highlighted the issue.
I would say that I don't think you can rule out any kind of mix of hybrid options here. I think you've just got way too many jurisdictions and too big a stack of responsibilities. I mean, ruling out any kind of hybrid option.
Yeah.
Well, maybe just put us to, we've got no alternative.
This analysis is a little bit like 3D chess in Star Trek, right? We're looking at it two-dimensionally, but if you add the third dimension, which is this issue of O&M versus capital, it becomes a three-dimensional issue.
Stephanie has done a great job on the chart, but I would propose that we add a new criteria, which means you have to.
No, I can't do it.
And that would be that criteria, it fits with this division between capital and maintenance and operation. Because not every model would fit with being able to do just part of the function, but some would be stronger at that. And so we've got that evaluation up front instead of after.
So I agree with where you're trying to go, but let me challenge you for a second to get it out on the table. So if you were to add a criteria, which is capability of the functions being served separately, you're now judging that that is a valid and important criteria that the group agrees on. The rest of them, I think the group has agreed on. I don't know if it's true. Do you think the group agrees that there is value in having the functions separate?
I don't know if they do, but I think you've exposed my bias.
By the way, for what it's worth, it's my bias as well.
Oh,
But there's a lot of advantages too. And the thing I love about this conversation is it's one of the rare times I see people sitting down up front and saying, what do we want to achieve, instead of backing into a result, which is so often what happens. Like, what's the easy, expedient thing to do, and we back into a result. So it's worth it. So should we do a quick binary pros and cons on separate together, or do people already have a gut feeling on what the answer is?
Is it too crass to just have people say their top three? See if there's any.
Well, hang on, that's the separate issue though. He's proposing to add the third.
Oh, all right.
He's proposing to add H.
Okay.
So So let's just do show of hands. You won't be held against you, okay? And you can change your vote in 3 minutes. But do you think it is better to have everything in one, or do you think it's better to have separate O&M and capital agencies? Okay, that's the question I'm going to ask. So who thinks it's better to have them separate? Okay, and who thinks it's better to have them all together? Okay. You and Reed, you guys should go drinking together.
How do you assume we don't?
Yeah.
Oh, say again?
How do you assume we don't?
So someone want to articulate why it should be together to counter the counterpoint to Nolan's comment?
I think both from a management and a governance perspective, the dynamics between capital investment and operations and maintenance are inextricable. And one implies other. And we do a lot of capital. The constant bitch from most of my people is operations wasn't at the table when you did design, construction, and where the hell were we? And it would run a lot better if we were at the front end of all of your work on capital.
So the coordination doesn't happen when it's separate.
So you could live without governance being separate, but I don't think you should live with management being separate. They're too inextricably tied.
Anyone want to add anything to that? Yeah, Phil.
Public accountability, single vision for the public to go to one agency that handles it all. And also on an operational level, again, just my experience at the board level recently was we're looking at capital improvements in service to operational expectations and service levels. And so that sort of just supports Michael's thing. And it's hard to separate them out. Reed probably has a much more practical view of that though.
Steve?
Just to add to it, I can't think of any other agency that works that way, where one agency is responsible for maintenance, and then you've got a completely different entity that does all the capital work. Can anybody throw out on the table an example of that?
In the Sacramento Valley, most of the agencies are that way. They're
Really?
separate. Yeah. Yeah.
King County, Washington as well, county-wide, handles the capital, works with the local jurisdictions, and they work together on deciding where the investment should be made.
Here's another example. They build, we O&M. Go ahead, though.
My answer of being separate was more of a 3D answer in the sense that we have the capital versus O&M. We also have the surface water versus the flood protection question. And I think there is a separation somewhere in there based on the non-levy capital projects having to do with pump stations and things of that nature. I just believe there's probably a separation of duties in there. I haven't yet identified exactly where they are.
So to your point about whether you back into a solution or whether you go forward into one, so in your experience, are these existing structures that are separate, or were they backed into? I know Louisiana was backed into. The locals didn't want to give up their local district, so the state came in and applied the overall umbrella. So I guess that's a question, were they backed into and then that's what they ended up with, or was it a thoughtful process to get to that model?
Well, I guess the best answer I can come up with is we all agree we don't get everything we want. Right? There's going to be some stuff we're not going to get. And the structures where it's separate, the factor that they said we're going to accede to this factor was politics. Right? They said, we think that we can overcome the coordination challenges of separate entities and not have to get into a political battle of people giving up their territories. And so the contrary view would be, we're going to fight the politics, we're going to get them to give up their territories, but now we have other challenges that we're having to put up with. That was just the way they balanced the criteria. I think
that's my point. I mean, I don't see a lot of value in ruling out any kind of hybrid option just because of the political realities that we've experienced in local kind of region. So
yeah.
I think it's. I agree that 7. 1 and 7 are kind of like our critical. We can apply that lens to these options.
Those are your political hallmarks. So I just want one more question. For the people against the glass who work for Multnomah County Drainage District or Levy Ready, Okay, the people who are implementing. I want you to raise your hand on separate or together. Okay? So who thinks they should be separate? And who thinks they should be together? Okay, so the people who are doing this professionally are in agreement with most of the leaders around the table.
Can I comment on that?
Yeah?
I think in the separation of capital from operations, there's a way to think about the capital in terms of the resource of the capital and not necessarily, whereas the operations side still plays a bigger role in the actual on the ground, the hiring of contractors, the determining of what the capital improvement plan is, but then they go out to some other agency or some larger partner to develop the actual fundraising. So you can still have, I could imagine at least still quite a bit of alignment in operations and capital at whatever the local manager is, but still partnering or coordinating with that larger district to actually fund it. So I'm not sure you necessarily have to move all the management of the capital to the funding, but that gets a little complicated. But that's just another level of the way I would think about separating capital from operations.
Your seatmate looks like she's going to explode.
No.
State of being.
I think that's no. Okay. I think that's a good point. I do think, though, thinking about the structure of when the districts were established and the assets that were within the districts at the time, and I think as development has occurred and the system has expanded, I think with our current capital needs and even our operation and maintenance requirements have grown at an exponential rate, especially I think over the last 20 years with all of the development coming online. So if it does stay separated, I think it would be important to make sure that the resources for appropriate O&M ability are right-sized.
Okay. Yes, Nolan.
If I can have just a real short rebuttal before my concession speech.
Yes. And Reed may want to support you.
There were two areas that sort of led me originally to that thought of having them separate. One is revenue capacity, because I think we need a bigger base to hit the large capital lifts. These smaller M&O and small capital lifts we could probably handle with any of these models. And the other is number 5, appropriate distribution of benefits and burdens. Who here represents the state?
Unfortunately, nobody today.
For example, when we get down to capital improvements, I think the state has a big part of that, because the purpose of the state is quality of life of its residents and through economic development. The levies are necessary for strong economic development because we've identified the number of jobs and we've got the port, which is a big engine in the state, part of it. So they should be part of the solution of those bigger capital issues. However, I think with the 7 criteria we've got, we can take and flush that out. So I concede single would be fine.
All right. Okay. Yeah.
Could I just throw out the one question
Yeah.
I have in this discussion is responsibility. In other words, from a federal perspective, if you did split it, and I got you conceding, but if you did split it, the question is who is responsible from a federal perspective for providing for the operations and maintenance of? And if you separate them, although is it truly if you add the separate, are the folks doing the O&M, are they the ones responsible to be the federal partner, or is the entity responsible? And that would just be a question that I would ask for clarity in any of the options. It's who is the responsible party to be that we had it up there before, being a partner for the feds. So I would just throw that out as a...
Yeah. So maybe it's worth talking about this just for one more moment, and then we'll actually get to the options. The model that I'm most familiar with, and therefore I have a natural bias towards, is what I see in the valley that I work in. And there what you have is you have a joint powers agency, which is like your IGA, and it is made up of a number of smaller entities, and some of them are O&M entities, and some of them are land use entities. And to go to your question, the JPA has the direct relationship with the Corps, but then the JPA passes down the O&Ming relationship to the O&M agencies, which tends to make the Corps happy because it knows that there's something larger that has financial resources if it gets beyond the everyday mowing, right? But the reason this model has worked well, and I'm not advocating, I'm just kind of filling in where Nolan didn't hit, is that people tend to have a lot of comfort with the locals doing the O&M. They tend to be folks they know, they're connected to, and they tend to trust that they're not doing Cadillac O&M, right? Because that's a concern locals have. We all want Cadillac O&M, but the locals don't want to pay for Cadillac O&M. So that tends to satisfy that. Whereas quite often, the locals are not confident in small entities doing capital. And they look for a bigger entity that's created specially for it. So that is one of the advantages of separate. But there's lots of models in the country of together that have been quite successful. And so there's no reason it has to be one or the other.
So this is number 2 on your list?
In our model, it would be through some kind of FGA. Our problem is
yes.
ORS 190 does not allow you to create an agency that has bonding capacity.
Right.
Yeah, it's either number 2 or it's number 11.
That's the challenge.
There's actually there's examples of both 2 and 11. Yeah.
Public corporation.
Actually, an IGA can issue revenue bonds.
Revenue bonds, right. Right. Joint, the joint signatures can do it together.
Yeah. Okay. So I rewrote up here what I thought we had said before, which is that the primary mission, to go back to Carl's question, is to achieve the appropriate level of risk management, which is both flood risk and surface water risk for the lands behind the levees and beyond. And that there are steps along the way, which include staying in the Corps' RIP program and FEMA's NFIP program. And then the secondary goal is to maximize community values and the performance of the risk management. Is there agreement that that's what we're trying to achieve? Does anyone disagree? Sometimes asking in the negative gets people to actually say if they disagree. Okay. So over here, we have an amazing chart. Thank you so much. You did that far better than I ever could have. And we have the criteria down the side. And little codes, I don't know if you can see them. We've got a $ here for revenue capacity. Number 2 is cost efficiency, so it's cost. Number 3 is legal, adequate legal authority. Number 4 is sensible and clear division of responsibilities. Number 5 is appropriate distribution of benefits and burdens. You wrote it as fairness. Number 6, or F, now that I've switched from letters to numbers, democratic control and equitable decision making. And the last one is politically viable. Okay? And I think I heard everybody say 1 in A and G, 1 in 7, maybe most important. Does anyone doesn't think that 1 and 7 are the most important? Maybe that they're showstoppers. If they can't be achieved, it doesn't matter how many of the others are achieved? Okay. So actually, I'm going to use a pen. Okay, this is one of those moments that I have to show how old I am, because if I don't put these on, I can't see anything.
Scott?
Yes. Now I can't see you.
Just for a little bit of information, do you have any experience with utilities versus property tax supported type entities? Anything you can inform us about those 2 models?
The California model, which is what I'm most familiar with, is their special property taxes voted on by the residents. They're assessments. They're not technically property taxes under state law. So in California, they are not part of your compression issue. They are assessments above and beyond. In California, there's a distinction between an assessment and a fee and a charge. They're all different things. And utilities have fees and charges because they're for actual services received, where you can say, I don't want the service anymore, and then they don't charge you the fee or the charge, like sewer or garbage, right? Levy protection doesn't meet that. You can't say, I don't want to pay for it this month. You're still getting the benefit of it. So it's considered an assessment under California law. It's not really a tax on property, and it's not really a utility because you can't say I don't want the service.
Okay,
So I'm not sure that my experience is terribly helpful for the Oregon model.
Things
Yeah.
look different here.
Yeah. Well, you might have it right, we might have it different. Okay, so voluntary regional partnership, status quo. Keep doing what you're doing, which has a lot of successes to it. So what do we think? Does that achieve the goal of adequate resources?
No.
Anyone think yes?
I agree with you, Reed.
Let's just double down on that vote.
Yeah.
Okay, really, did anyone think that it works? No?
All I want to say is all things equal between the 4 districts. Is that a true statement with all districts?
It's not, no, they're not all equal. They're formed under different sections of statute.
And they all have different needs and different revenue streams.
Yeah.
So
Go ahead.
when you look at all 4, it's a different discussion. But when you look at Penn 1, Penn 2, and CDD or SCIC, they have different answers or different responses.
Right. So one of the challenges with the options we have, and this is not to say that it's not the best we can do with this kind of situation, is status 1 can work with money if the state says here's $300 million, right? But it requires an overlay, and then we start getting into the other ones. But I think as a practical matter, if we're just looking at the 4, the status quo and resources, it seems like the group says no. The answer is no on money.
I've got a hesitant yes. And the reason why is we've raised how much money through this current system. And by using it, someone got the dollar amount?
6 million.
Okay, and what it has allowed is that each of the different entities have different ability to raise revenue. They've got different tools they can use under state law, and they've also got different challenges. So by being able to use a voluntary system, and sort of voluntary makes me feel a little more comfortable, so that no one can be opt-out. Allowing each to take and opt in with the resource revenue capacity that they have, I think, has some value. So I wouldn't put it as a high, but I'd sort of put it as a low medium.
I'll just counterpoint my esteemed colleague from next door in Fairview. The problem you create is what happens when somebody opts out. What happens when somebody says that's too much, but if somebody says I can't do it. It's worked well so far, but with the bigger projects that are coming down the road, it'll be increasingly tougher to get the politics of each individual district to agree necessarily to continue to give money. And just as, Reed coming on, bended knee to beg for money from the city of Troutdale last week, we of course said yes because we love Reed. It's just a laborious and a difficult and an indeterminate process that I think this problem needs a more steady funding source than how many different agencies have to get together, what, 8, 9,
13.
Pardon?
13.
13, thank you. It's just like you may create a problem down the road.
So I'm going to mark red unless someone wants to convince me not to. If you're going to argue for red, you don't need to. If you have something else, then please share
I
it.
was just going to say, to speak for MCD, what's the deferred capital right now?
Yeah.
So it is not worked. I mean, it exceeds $6 million, I would assume, by orders of magnitude.
So I'm reading it. Anyone object?
You should read A and G for the same reasons.
Everyone agree that we should read G for the same reason?
Well,
It works great as long as everyone's being collaborative, but the moment one entity says, it's not my priority right now.
It works fine right now because we're responding to a situation that respectfully sort of reflects crisis, but over the long haul, political interests are going to
Okay.
be far.
Anyone want to argue otherwise?
And I'd argue if we weren't in the economic climate we've been in the last 3 years, we wouldn't all be able to be at the table right now.
Okay.
I guess I would caution putting it at red. I mean, you could do the same thing for anything that needs a legislative fix. I mean, I can say that you can't ensure that the bills can successfully emerge from any legislative session.
But I think it's a weakness to have
It's absolutely weakness.
a structure that depends on good intentions always to make critically important decisions work for the protection of the citizens. I think that fundamentally isn't a great way to approach this thing. That there's the best of intentions can, even when people want to do the right thing, can't do the right thing. You know, structurally, we shouldn't be in a position where lives and property are at risk because of the ability of people to work around here. Just amending this IGA to this little thing is extremely clumsy. So I just think that, I mean, we can make the argument about other options, but I think to allow that to happen, to continue that, given the magnitude of what we see in front of us, it's absolutely a red in my opinion.
Everyone okay with that?
I would probably color that one yellow-orange because I think there is a big political benefit in not having to create something. I mean, it exists. So to that, from a certain perspective, it is viable because it already exists. But I think there is, as you said, a huge risk of it failing or collapsing in the future when the economy gets tough or the amount of money needed becomes much larger.
They can't do number one. We've had like 5 meetings to talk about how they cannot do number one. They can't raise enough money to do it. How politically are they going to raise enough money?
And we've seen how compression over time is going to make it harder and harder to do that.
Unless they're going to go change the state constitution, they can't do it.
Well, the challenge that I see is it's working well now because you're in alignment on big picture goals. The moment we get to a more specific goal, like should we strengthen the cross levy or shouldn't we strengthen the cross levy? Suddenly the room splits.
Well,
and
you can count commitment in commas and zeros.
I guess we should mark it because we're having this discussion because we think it's not a real option, so we should just move on.
Okay.
If an option has a red box, you shouldn't be spending a lot of time figuring out the second red box.
I think that's what we're trying to get to.
Okay, so we're not even going to discuss these. We're just going to move to option number 2 now.
I just want to reiterate Tom's comment about there may be a district or two, Sabi Island and Sandy, that could go it alone. I mean, there's some potential there. I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I think that's a good note for like a hybrid discussion.
Yeah, we're talking about system here.
Right.
Okay. New flood control agency created by IGA. State law allows local governments to combine their powers. The partners could come together to create a 190 agency. The new agency could take responsibility for nearly all local flood risk management function or could split responsibility with existing districts. So, money?
Under current state law, can you create an agency, Jeff, that operates as a utility?
You could. As was mentioned previously, all the members of the IDA can contribute their powers, so the city and the county certainly have powers to do
Create utility.
Yeah, so, and districts do that too. So,
Right.
so yes,
Yeah. So it falls actually into the 4, 5, 6, 7 category, and I think it's very viable if you can formulate the financing as a utility model.
All right. Everyone agree? Anyone disagree?
So you're saying that's not a separate option from 4, 5, 6?
Well, I'm just saying it falls
It's
into the
expansion.
utility.
Right, it's all in the
It
utility
could be
model.
a utility
Right.
model.
It matches the financial aspects of these
Right.
with a governance aspect that's
Right,
different.
exactly.
The only question I would add to that, or extension of that, is that it's used so infrequently in Oregon. There really isn't a good example other than my own recollection of MWMC in Eugene, Springfield.
911 centers are mostly 190 agencies.
But we haven't applied it to something like this flood control. I'm just saying that, so it's a question.
actually we did. The 4 districts created the 190 agency to handle contracting for the
Flood-ready Columbia.
So we didn't have to have 4 separate entities for
But I'm thinking more just the revenue,
Operation.
the financial capacity piece of this, and that's number one, the dollars, is that, I think it could, I don't disagree with that, it's just that we have limited experience how we've actually turned that into reality, so that's the question mark.
Well, what you're saying, I think what you're saying is, if I'm hearing you correctly, is that the G box for it may be yellow or orange. We're not sure because of lack of familiarity.
Yeah.
You've got a political hill to climb. I mean, you can do it financially, legally,
Yeah.
technically, you can do it.
So,
But because we're not familiar, it's like trying to go to a mileage fee for replace the gas.
So
So-
where does the funding come from? Cities, counties? I mean, does each entity have to set up their own new stream that goes into this money?
I think you'd have to create some kind of a model that would assess appropriately. It's difficult. Yeah.
I've done a little thinking about that. The entity, we've delegated the entity the authority to adopt stormwater fees. And then also, as part of the agreement, this would require all the cities and counties to be in the agreement. That would be levy on local utility, right on charge of local utilities based upon some formula. Then you could do it that way without having each entity have to do more than something.
Correct.
so Michael, in your mind, is it orange or is it green? Orange is medium. Red is no. Green is yes. Orange is maybe.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, I think A is green and I think G is yellow
G
or
is,
orange.
that's a little
I think
different.
I think the challenge will be getting a number of elected bodies to buy into a formula to distribute costs in an equitable way. I think that's where the challenge is the politics of it. We can conceptualize a model. I don't think that's a problem. Selling that model could be a challenge.
The idea of a new fee in Gresham is going to be difficult.
Not a problem.
I don't know about travel.
Yeah, Portland's deck lined up to take.
See, in Portland, we're already paying $600,000. I can just go to the council and say, you're already paying $600,000. So I'm giving you a different way to distribute that $600,000, and maybe more, obviously. If we have to
600 for the status quo.
Yeah, right. Sure. There's a cost issue.
So is the group's preference that we do A and G for all 11 and then come back and do the center?
Yes.
Or do we want to?
Yes.
Okay.
One
was clear.
Caveat, as was mentioned on 2A, is you don't get very much in the way of bonding authority. You
You
can
do if it's a utility model because there'll be revenue bonds. And you can issue jointly revenue bonds.
So I wrote, I don't know if you can see it, but I wrote utility model in the middle of the green because that seems to be how it works financially.
It's a threshold issue, I think.
Okay. Number 3, expand and consolidate drainage districts. The existing drainage districts could expand to take in a larger geographic area. Geographic expansion would be straightforward if the districts consolidated first. They would then take responsibility for capital improvements as well as the current functions of the drainage districts. Reed.
Just to spark conversation, there's been a historic conversation about expanding the districts to meet the floodplain, not just the basin at the bottom. And I think that's where these conversations lie, and that there are beneficiaries that send water into the system.
You mean the entire drainage?
You mean no? Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm not so, I don't believe that it really expands the financial capacity that much. Not to achieve number 1. But it has certainly been a part of the historical conversation of what is the right governance structure for the districts to meet the status quo.
Well, let's start down here because from the memo, if I recall, it requires that the landowners in the expanded area would have to vote to agree to the expansion, correct? Okay.
unless you got a state legislative change.
Okay, which I'm going to kind of hit under here as the panacea. So does that make this an orange or a red? Will people not in the current drainage districts, what is their reaction going to be on why they should be included in an expanded drainage district? Will it be hell no, or will it be explain it to me?
Explain it to me. They don't want to pay twice for the same service of moving stormwater. So if it's clear as a bell, maybe they don't care. But there's the potential for getting dinged twice for the same service. And so I think that's a homeowner's reaction potentially.
And unfortunately, I've not yet encountered anything in this domain that's clear as a bell.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
I was just going to say, from the Columbia City watershed boundary, at least in the city of Portland, most of those in that way, everyone in the region is just as potable as from Alameda Ridge to Corner Boulevard.
And of the properties that do drain that way, yeah, I would be fascinated to see a analysis of their marginal capacity to take on more cost. You're talking about neighborhoods that may not have that kind of capacity.
So do I hear orange and orange?
I think G's a red.
You think it's, you think this is red?
It takes me a half hour to explain to Ray's board how we differ from the service that his public works department provides. I can't imagine a campaign that would get residents to say, yeah, I'm in. You know, charge me again. I've been really lucky the last 8 years, but now I'm willing to pay.
I would also add.
We probably wouldn't sell it that way, by the way.
Oh, does the city also give the districts, MCDD specifically, city corporations, that funding from stormwater that they're paying? So if that cost was already being given to districts, they still have capital.
So anyone think it shouldn't be red down here? Okay.
I would also add you're going to have some really difficult messaging about where you draw that boundary, and saying you should pay, but your neighbor shouldn't pay because why?
People who are on UICs versus the ones. Yeah. It'll be an interest in that. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Can I just have a clarifying, what was the analysis that you'd like to see of taking on additional costs? Is that like at a household
Yeah,
level?
probably at the household level, looking at median incomes in the new district.
I thought it was a facetious I'd like to see.
No, that's not facetious. If we were going to do it.
Oh yeah, if we were going to do it.
definitely
Yeah. Okay. What about this? Is this red or orange?
It's orange at best.
Orange at best.
Orange at best. Reddish orange.
But G's red, so it's like a
Yeah.
Yeah.
That whole option is a necessary but sufficient condition.
I'm going to agree because it won't matter, it's already done.
Let's talk about options 4, 5, 6, and 7, I guess, are all utility models. And who here in the room is best to just give a 1 minute on what a utility model is to make sure everyone understands? Would it be Mike?
Utility in this room.
He's done the research.
Henry?
I don't think I'm the best person in the room. I don't run a utility, but
if only there was someone in the room that ran a utility.
It means creating some sort of governance structure that has the legal ability to charge a usage fee that would not be considered a property tax. And I think Jeff will need to advise us, if we decide to pursue one of these options further down the road, we'll need to be careful about how we design a fee that can be exempt from property tax compression and not be considered a property tax under Oregon law. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about who has the authority and how you would do that.
Well, a city or a county all have sort of inherent inherent authority to adopt utilities. And when Measure 5 was passed, I go back that far. I'm sorry to admit. But everybody was in the process of adopting sort of stormwater utility fees, which was a new thing at the time. And then more recently, the issues come up in the context of street utilities. And the key is that we've got to be able to tie the fee to an actual service so it is not considered tax. And it cannot be a charge on a property owner solely as a result of property ownership. So there has to be a way to avoid it. And most municipalities after Measure 5 did accomplish that by adopting, revising their ordinances so that the user pays. So the user could be a renter, and so it's not a charge on property as a result of property ownership. And since that time, these new utility charges have gone on the bill, and they have gone against the user, and usually are implemented as part of the water and or sewer fee that's charged by the municipality. So the way I would see something like this being set up, and there's, as mentioned in here, multiple different ways of doing it, is you'd establish a region-wide utility and then figure out, the devil detail is figuring out how to then come up with a fee that A is going to be sufficient to fund your capital and operating needs, and then B is going to be equitably distributed, and C accepted by the residents as additional charge. And that is, but it could be done. It could be done by any of these models that are listed.
And so, is it enough under Oregon law to say that it can be charged to the renter instead of the landowner in order to avoid being, taxed as a result of ownership?
Yeah, it just can't be solely on the basis of ownership. So that creates some issues in collection. Before Major 5, there was a fee that was against property, and that was the part that was potentially converted into a property tax. And that definition of property tax in Measure 5 is the reason why we don't have that distinction between assessments and fees and charges that they do in California. I wish we did. One other thing I'd want to mention about utility as opposed to the property tax model is any of the property tax, if you create a new entity that's going to have the authority to charge property taxes, particularly for operations, you are going to be adding another government to the compression pie, and that's a potential problem with that. And to the extent that you're creating a new taxable entity that can go out for GO bonds, then you are potentially competing with everybody else that needs to go out for GO bonds. So that's something to think about when thinking about the decision between a taxing entity and a utility.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify when you said the utility fee acceptable to residents, do they vote on
that's a good question. In some jurisdictions, they actually do. I don't know if anybody in the metro area actually votes on utility fees, but that's always a risk. I actually think Westland and Oregon City do have a vote if they're getting a precinct.
I'm not sure about that.
I don't know.
They're part of Tri-City.
People vote on their counselor.
They vote on the counselors, yeah.
So, that's a risk. If you set it too high, that somebody will attempt to do that by charter. But I know because I've represented cities pretty much throughout my career, and every time it comes up, you're trying to increase the utility fee. You have the economic model, which is how much money do we need to raise in order to meet our capital needs and meet the operation, versus can we really impose that large of an increase on our citizens at this point without having somebody storing the steal.
Well, whether they vote or not, a fee increase act by a governing body would be referable to city. They could.
Let me be lawyer geeky for a second with you. So if I own a mobile home park and I rent spots out to mobile homes with a utility fee, I get completely how, as the property owner, it's not on me, there's no damage to my property from a flood, and all of it could be on the mobile homeowners. But if I own a house and I rent it to you, and there's a flood, my house is damaged, separate from your belongings being damaged. So why in that case is it not considered a property tax and it's still considered a utility? How could you shift the burden of the payment to the renter when it's the homeowner's property that's actually damaged?
All I can say is the question about that for surface water utilities has been to the Supreme Court, and the Oregon Supreme Court, and they've upheld it on the rationale that I just mentioned.
Okay.
Whether or not it might be subsequently challenged as being, is that really true or not? I mean, there's a lot, one of the arguments in that case was, well, that's not really true. This is just papering over the fact that it really does get paid by the property owner. And there's a little bit of truth to that. But it was sufficient to fool a lawyer, I guess, at least that's the justice of the Supreme Court.
And as we evaluate whether to green those, then, do you have any concern that the exemption for surface water management wouldn't get extended to flood risk management, meaning water is coming from the river through a levee? Do you see a distinction there that creates some level of risk, or for you, are they part and parcel?
I think it's close enough that I'm not overly concerned about it. Somebody could raise that issue. That issue was a big concern, I think, when people with jurisdictions who were adopting transportation utility fees as a method to raise additional revenue, because that is, but again, that was justified based on the basis that these folks who now they use the transportation system, and even if they don't use it, they get the benefit of it. And therefore, it's a charge directly related to the service, and you're not charging any more than the service, or you're not charging this fee and then using it for general government purposes. So
Okay.
that's sort of the distinction in Oregon that some of you boards have.
Good, thank you. I think that's a useful background conversation then for thinking about these. So everyone clear on the utility model generally before we talk about the 4 different variations to it? Okay, so number 4, a special district could operate a utility for drainage services. The municipal utility charges user fees for its services rather than raising revenue through property sales or income. The new district could include the area of existing Columbia Corridor drainage districts and encompass a larger geographic area. The new district could assume all of the current functions of the drainage districts plus funding capital projects. So this is a brand new district which is not being run by the existing districts or the city or the county. Do I have that right, Henry?
That's the idea. And 4 and 5 are pretty similar here. I think 4 is create something new while leaving the drainage districts in place. And, 4 is create something new that takes all the functions. And 5 is create something new on top of the existing drainage districts. So there's not a dramatic difference there. And either way, you know, it would be a special district that would be the formal governing body. And there's a few different options you have under state law. There's, you know, drainage districts, obviously, or flood control districts and water improvement districts and so on.
So how is the district created at number 4? Who creates it? Is it created by the 4? Is it just a new entity that goes and says, we are creating ourselves? I mean, it's clear to me under 6 and 7 that the city and the county create it. But in number 4, who is the creating, who are the drivers of creating it?
That's a question I don't really know the answer to yet.
But fortunately, we have a lawyer with us.
Actually, a group of people can get together and petition to the county, petition the county to form a drainage district. There's a land use process you have to go through, and then a financial capacity process you have to go through, and there's a number of points where somebody could throw a wrench into the works, but ultimately, and it's referable, but ultimately the county would approve that, and if nobody further, then it would get set up with the Secretary of State's office and
Okay.
County commission acts as the boundary commission, basically.
So the county commission is the arbiter on whether to create it.
Right.
Okay. So based on all the steps and challenges you just identified in that process, I'm thinking that this is orange or red.
I think it's orange.
Orange.
Orange? Okay.
And yeah, 4 and 5 are very similar there, so it's orange.
Okay. Does everyone agree 5 is orange too? Anyone disagree?
These are both the sole, whatever that additional criteria.
Sole purpose entity.
Sole purpose entity.
Yeah, it'd be
Yeah.
special districts under state law.
Okay,
They have
so
their own elected board.
my question on 4 and 5, and it sort of goes to the blue thing that I asked him to write on the board there, is when you,
Which is, for those who can't see it, what is our problem statement was the question that Stephanie asked.
So, when Henry, when you guys talked about this, what was the problem? What did either 4 or 5 solve that is currently maybe an issue with the structure as it exists? Because this is probably the least change of any of the options, other than total status quo. So why was this perceived to be better?
Well, it expands your tax base. How much it expands your tax base is a question mark.
Yeah, and it's really the utility, the shift from the assessment that is considered a property tax under current law to a utility model. I have a question though about 5. You really need to be very clear as to the purpose of the overlay, because you can't have 2 districts over the same territory with the same purpose. That's a game.
Well, to go to Nolan's comment, the reason you would have the overlay is the local districts would continue O&M, and the overlaying district would do capital.
You just have to be very clear that that's the reason that you're doing the overlay.
Scott, we have parts of our jurisdictions that aren't compressed right now. I really think the 4 and 5 just solve the compression issue, because you're just shifting the same amount of burden from one mechanism to another. And those areas that are not under compression are, in fact, the Sandy Drainage Improvement Company still has a revenue problem. So we would just be changing the mechanism from a property assessment to a utility, but not having the ability to raise capital, solve the capital problem.
So A, maybe red.
I think it's red.
But I think it's red for both of them.
But it depends also how widely you draw the boundaries.
For number 5.
Right. So for number 5,
Well,
I
really
think for
for
either
both.
of them, you could, in theory, you could draw this boundary countywide. In principle.
Well, you can refer at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That includes a larger, they both include larger.
So if you could expand it beyond the existing boundary, which presumably you wouldn't just create an overlay that's the exact same size, then there is more revenue generating capacity from 4 and 5 than there is from 1. There's just not a lot more.
Not a lot more, and I would change G in 5 to red.
Because the bigger you go, the bigger the political problem you're creating. Well, my belief is that 4 and 5 for A are orange, and the fact that they're orange and there's orange at the bottom, it probably are the death knell to those options anyway. Probably don't need to change orange to red.
Before you put the death nail in, I've got a question for legal counsel, and I apologize if you already answered it. Can either 4 or 5 use general obligation bonds for big capital projects?
It depends on the special district, but the answer is yes for the special districts.
I think that's an advantage. It's an advantage that cities have but don't often use, in that they've got a water utility, and if their water rates are such that they would rather have a general obligation bond versus a revenue bond, they have that option. I don't know many cities that go with general obligation bonds instead of revenue bonds, but in this case, that may be the case because we may not be able to have a high enough utility rate to handle a revenue bond situation where if we're talking large industrial ratepayers, they might be able to afford the general obligation bond, and the general obligation bond is outside ballot measure 5, correct?
Right. If it's voted.
And that's the other side of it, has to be voted.
Well,
I've seen the voters approve some squirrely stuff like this. Not that you're squirrely,
So I don't remember who asked Henry, but someone asked Henry what the difference. Oh, I guess it was Stephanie asked Henry, what's the advantage of 4 and 5 over existing condition? And the answer was, well, the ability to tax people based on utility rates as opposed to property, and then potentially the ability to expand geographically beyond. Having said that, I still don't hear people say it solves all of our problems economically. But will 6 or 7 be any better than 4 or 5 in this same category?
Yes.
Yeah.
Why?
Because you can distribute, first of all, you can use existing methodologies within the city. It gets you a more equitable and larger base to distribute upon. It's not a perfect base, but it's larger. I mean, we have familiar methodologies for changing the rate base. I think the special district one, when you begin to expand the boundary, where do you stop? And once you're beyond the area within the slough, the methodology for the distribution of cost, burden, benefit distribution starts to get very difficult. So if you're going to do this, you better create it in such a way that it can survive court.
So Reed, is that your comment that that's why these maybe should be edged in red?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll edge them in red while Phil offers his comment.
I'm wondering if 4 and 5 actually might be more advantageous than 6 or 7, and that the boundary could go beyond 6 or 7's current jurisdictions and capture a bigger base. I see the political difficulty in making sure that we can explain the benefits, you know, out there, but the jurisdictions, excuse me, that receive income tax and property tax as a result of the drainage districts being viable, that would be the beneficiary boundary line. So maybe it goes beyond the state of Oregon. State of Oregon, right? So maybe it's a
go beyond that.
It could be at least a Multnomah County wide, maybe Multnomah and Clackamas. I'm not advocating for that, but the point is there are beneficiaries that we can point to that would justify expanding the boundary beyond the city of Portland. That's all.
And along those lines, I think what I didn't say earlier, Stephanie, one of the advantages of 4 and 5 in my mind was equity, because you can expand to take in a larger area, therefore, you know, tapping into a larger base of beneficiaries. Also, you can design a rate structure where the people in the floodplain pay more. Maybe there's a fixed charge that everybody pays just for being part of the special district, and then there's a higher charge for people in the floodplain who are directly benefiting and whose properties are, you know, staying dry. So you can tweak that formula to make it more equitable, but we haven't really talked about equity much yet.
And just to note, you can do differential fees and differential taxes as long as there's a rational basis.
As long as there's a rational difference in service. And so those are
under the various utility models, can you do, this is for Jeff, can you construct a system development charge as well?
Yes, you could do that. In fact, Hillsborough is doing that for the South Hillsborough development because there's some
you can do special system development districts.
So you can do differential system development charges. You can do differential utility charges if new development's coming up and needs to increase the costs. So you do have to have there has to be at least a rational basis for it, and preferably one that's based upon rate-making principles in order to survive potential challenge. But it's legally possible.
Which is, I mean, that's what I think an important distinction given the status quo. You really can't do that. You have one trick. That's all you have in the toolbox. Under this one, you'd have the fee and charge concept, and also the potential for system development charge. So for development in the district, a different way to help pay for costs.
Sure. Carl, you had something?
Yeah, I was just wondering if the city of Portland, as Michael describes, has a fairly sophisticated methodology. Do the other?
I didn't say that.
Okay. Do the other cities have to agree, and are we in an IGA situation then because of the other cities within the corridor?
Thank you.
That's why they're teaching. I think there would be a practical collection problem that would require IGAs for the city. If you had a separate district, they legally have the authority to charge a fee and impose it directly. But how would you?
Right.
But it seems to me what we're talking about, maybe I misunderstand this one, but is it essentially the city of Portland because it has the biggest capacity and the best, I say largest staff. Would be the leader in
I resemble that remark.
Yeah, fantastic.
There you go.
Anyway, that they would take the lead, but that the smaller cities would enter into agreements with the city of Portland or follow, the same model, because otherwise you get large inequities.
I think that's also kind of option 6.
Yeah, it's a
yeah. What's interesting is I hear a lot of distinctions between 4, 5, 6, and 7, but I'm not sure that any of the distinctions I'm hearing result in a different grading of 4, 5, 6, and 7. So for example, you hear, oh, the advantage here is there's an existing methodology that you can plug in, but then it has a slight disadvantage that you have to coordinate with the other cities, right? Here, you have the disadvantage, there's no existing methodology, but you don't have to coordinate with the other cities. And you don't have existing methodology, but you might be able to expand beyond a city boundary and create the right boundary. And so my sense is that probably these are all different but equal for different reasons. And these are probably all different but equal for different reasons. Because here you have the coordinating with other cities issue, even though in theory the city can just create the utility. And that probably the key distinctions are going to be in here between the models. Does anyone disagree with that observation?
I think you've got shades of orange here.
Yeah.
I think 7 is different than 6, in that 6 requires that coordination with cities, but 7
doesn't.
That's true. Okay.
And IGA coordination is much different than the orange we were placing there was mostly around the concern about extension of the voter base for approval purposes.
Right.
That's not the case with either 6 nor 7. It's a government to government issue.
It's a different political issue.
Which is far different, and we're collaborating.
It's a different political issue. It's still a political issue, but a different kind.
Yeah, yeah.
So what color do we think this is? Is this orange and this is orange? Is this orange and this is green?
Yeah, I think for me, 6 is orange also. For me, 7 is less orange.
Yeah.
It's a little closer to green.
So is this orange with a tinge of red and this is orange? Or is this orange and this is orange and green?
That's yellow on 7.
We don't have a yellow marker, I'm sorry.
Do we have a highlighter?
All right.
Yeah, someone's going to find a yellow highlighter and then we'll be there. Okay.
But none of them are off the table.
None of them are off the table.
That's the proposal.
Yeah. 6 is orange, and 7 is orange and green.
Or yellow if we can come up with a marker. There we go. We got yellow now.
So I've got to say, 7 is orange too.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead, argue.
6 is orange, and 7 is orange too.
Well, and I was going to ask about the Multnomah County, which has been trying to get out of the municipal service business now for what, 25 years?
Exactly. So I mean, it'd be, you know,
It would be a reversal of 25 years of history.
yeah. So I mean, I think you've got to just acknowledge that there's political challenges for 4, 5, 6, and 7. They're all kind of a different flavor. But
So you good with orange, Reed? Or do you really want to argue for yellow? Okay.
It was just.
Depends on whether Jules family is still on the board or not.
I do think there are substantial differences. I do think there are substantial differences on the revenue side among these 4.
Well, let's talk about that. What do you think the color should be for the 4 of them on the revenue side?
Scott, before we
Oh,
do,
yeah.
Jeff had his hand up.
I had one little comment about 7 that might make it easier to sell, and that is one of the things we could do, and this goes back to the comment we made earlier, is separate flood control from the drainage surface water management function. And actually, the cities in the county can take over the surface water management function from the drainage districts, and then you could have a county service district that would do the flood control part. So Multnomah County is not in the utility business except for that little small piece that's unincorporated and still really IGA important to do. And that might make that a more palatable situation. One thing that I thought about working in the districts in the last 4 years is that, as somebody mentioned earlier, this was set up as a way to de-water land for agriculture, but now in the drainage districts, it's set up to manage surface water for industrial development. And that's not really functionally different than for a city, which already has that ability. So you already have overlapping jurisdictions there. MCDD and City of Portland have an IGA to deal with that, but that's one. Well, it still may be orange because that would require, in order to do that, that would require each individual city to be able to be willing to assume the obligations of the drainage districts for stormwater and territory. And there it is. So the expense of that is we know.
Okay.
Hey, Scott?
Yeah.
Just a process, because this is not, but it's a process question. As I'm reading the criteria, are you mixing now, the way I read A is funding capacity. In other words, the ability of how much money things like IGAs and whether cities have to do that, isn't that a different criteria under D? And so isn't the discussion kind of mixing those two right now? So under funding capacity, is there going to be more money or not? Is it just simple read of this? And it sounds like the discussion is mixing a different criteria. So
Yeah.
in the for what it's worth the process.
I agree. I think it sounds like 4 through 7 should be green for revenue.
Because in theory, you could get the money.
Theoretically, there are ways to solve the funding issue. And we acknowledge that there's a bunch of political error attached to any option.
Right. Yeah, I think so. I think that all of them, to get to your point, Kevin, they all bring money in that isn't otherwise available, and more money than is otherwise available under the status quo. The question of what the legal mechanism is different in each one, and we'll get into down here.
That's just in the process.
A friendly amendment. I don't think 4 is green. It is the same base.
But it doesn't have to be the way it's described. The way it's described, it could still be a larger geographic area.
The description says it can be larger.
So, I mean, I think 4 and 5 are green and some orange because it depends on how big you make the boundary. And then, you know, that's in tension with the politics of it. 6 and 7, I think, are green because there are political challenges, but you can get the money, right? There are enough people in the rate-paying area that you can raise the revenue.
So I'm going to suggest this. I'm going to write here under 4 and 5 in orange, boundary dependent. And then with that caveat, I think they're all green, right? Because this is green, boundary dependent. Big enough boundary, it's green. Small boundary, it's not.
It's kind of the same issue for city and county, because you're presuming that if it's city or county, that we would draw that fee boundary of the whole city. That's not necessarily true. We might set that fee boundary.
Well, that's true as well.
For Columbus.
So I guess they're all boundary dependent.
I think it's all.
Okay.
Which should be a guess.
Well, we pay the district $600,000 a year. It's in base. The person who is out on Johnson Street pays for that too. Oh, you know, you have political problems, so do we.
Yeah.
But
I don't know about any of you, but the smells up here are getting interesting. Boundary dependent. Okay, let's work to get through 8 through 11 for criteria A and G, and then we'll decide which ones we want to get into more detail on.
Scott,
yes.
Before you go into 8, 9, is the conversation about 9, would it also consider a utility model that's metro-wide or something bigger than the county?
Well,
so 8 is Multnomah County with a property tax, which is a familiar model that we've used for other kinds of services. 9 and 10 are Metro and the Port, and I didn't really specify what the funding mechanism is. And I don't know if Metro or the Port have the authority to do utilities.
Well, the Port does, but the funding mechanisms that you sort of exemplified in the description are illegal.
Okay.
For the purposes of our discussion.
Okay.
So you can do it, but it's illegal?
we have bonding capacity, you know, and we have untapped property tax assessment capacity. But again, we would be competing, you know, against schools. And politically, we've made the decision not to assert our property tax capacity because we don't want to take money away from schools. So we don't use the capacity we have.
So
politically, I think it's red, the Port. Might be orange in the money.
Well, you're jumping ahead. You're trying to talk all about the Port.
I guess my point is, before we leave the utility model section, there's still probably a conversation about utility models that are with a broader base.
I'm not sure Metro has the authority under their charter to form a utility under state law. I don't think.
I don't believe we do either.
Under state law?
You know, it's interesting, because
they're
a special district,
hybrid.
they have a charter.
Right.
So they have brought, so there's this broad rule presumption that you can do it because it's preempted. But your charter also specifically lists what Metro can do and can't do. And I don't think Have you worked on that all?
Yeah.
I believe we have the authority under state law, but the charter is a delimiter, so it would require a charter change. And I tell you, that's a non-starter for our council. Let's be honest.
I think
Okay.
that, Metro has the ability to deal with any matters of metropolitan concern. It's the last sentence in the charter.
You need a vote.
You need a
MPAC
vote.
or a vote of the people.
Correct.
MPAC you need if you're taking over the functions of existing governments. Yeah, but what I'm saying is Metro does have the authority.
Oh, yeah,
Correct.
I think they clearly do.
Let's see.
Okay, let's do multi-county, let's do Multnomah County first. The premise on number 8 was it's a property tax funded effort. Does that make it orange because of compression, or does that make it red because of compression?
Red.
Be a bigger area.
But it's a big area, yeah.
You can get enough money.
Yeah, you can raise enough money.
It may make it red politically.
I think it's red.
Yeah, down the bottom's red.
So is it green or orange?
I think it's
Green.
Green?
You can raise enough.
Okay. So it's,
Would we expect there to be a tiered rate in the town? Or it's open to?
You could do a tiered property tax rate based on different levels of service, right?
Yeah, I think the biggest problem is when Multnomah County created the district, in order for it to have tax authority, you have to vote, set a new tax base.
Yeah, you have to put a permanent rate on the ballot, it has to be voted.
Approve it.
Right.
Otherwise, it wouldn't have any.
That's why it's red.
does everybody agree it's red?
They just sell it for the library.
Okay, does anyone think it's not red? Okay. Dark red, I heard? Blood red? Okay, Metro. Let's start with the political. Did I hear orange?
Darker red than red.
Darker red than red.
Purple maybe, I don't know.
Okay, so I got another red here. So says Mr. Metro. Okay.
Is that because the existing council is unwilling to
No,
take
no, no.
risk, or is there
No, I just
some
think,
other
think about,
reason for safety?
sorry. Think about the sort of the arguments and extensions that have been made relative to special district and so on, using Metro's general obligation capacity, right? And I'm going to go to 3 counties, and I have to convince them that there's a benefit in Clackamas and Washington County. And while I can say, you use the airport, you use this, the likelihood of that is pretty thin at best.
So
We did it for the convention center.
So I may have prematurely,
What?
I may have prematurely put red in for Metro because Metro said it's red, but
Leave it open to
you also have an
conversation.
interest maybe in it being red, right? So what do folks think? What's the appropriate color? Stephanie?
I guess, you know, I think you can argue that you can put red on political viability on everything, and because it's about strategy, and, you know, it's a question of degree. I mean, sure, everybody can make an argument about why, you know, they won't be accepted, but people pass ballot measures and people get new taxes and people do stuff all the time. And so for us to just sort of reject out of hand that, well, it just, well, this will never happen, you know, I just think you have to think about that.
What are the...
I actually think it's closer to orange and it may be even yellow. And I'm going to advocate here. That this is not necessarily an objective opinion, but this region underutilizes that tool to solve what are regional problems. And that levy is a regional problem, maybe even statewide, arguably. I get the political issue. I certainly get that you're going to need political will to even get beyond the council, let alone to voters or MPAC. But I just think we underuse what is a unique tool in this nation, quite frankly, to solve regional problems.
So what are the key political obstacles? And I will clearly admit, I didn't elucidate very much what 9 and 10 would entail, because I think there's a lot of question marks about exactly how you'd set it up and how you'd fund it. But what are the key political obstacles on 9? You have to get council approval, clearly.
council impact, depending on what configuration it is. It's potentially a charter change and ultimately voters.
It's a layered kind
It's
of
a
thing,
it's
depending on how
multiple
you
layers.
structure.
So
It can't be any more, I just can, I'll advocate on behalf of ourselves. Even if we were taking, it shouldn't be any different in color than Multnomah County, frankly. I have a hard time understanding how Multnomah County can be one color and Metro's another color. That just makes no sense.
I think in the property tax piece is the one that's stopping me, right? I mean, we're gonna create a permanent rate.
Right, the county's orange here.
Yeah.
The county's orange here,
It's going to.
Right.
where
So
it's red here
should be
because of the
should be
property.
The same,
Well,
either way.
Right.
No,
but-
you have
but
Multnomah
for
County's
utility,
red.
Right, but if you're looking at the property tax question, we create a permanent rate region-wide, and folks who are served by water services, who are paying utilities fees on top of that.
So then there's no doubt there's a challenge. One of the issues, I think, to be considered between these models is the size of the base. Do you know what you can raise with a penny in Metro?
Oh, yeah.
It's absolutely green on the A part, no problem.
But the size of the levy, whether it's 5 cents or 25 cents,
That matters.
plays to the political.
Yeah. It plays the compression effect.
Is this the only levy system in Metro? Are there others?
Zoo.
No, you mean levy with two E? Or levy. We have a perm.
Control area.
That's the old perm tax has been rolled in. Yeah, there's a perm tax that's been rolled in.
I think it's 9.6.
And it's been operating levies from that. And then we have our two bonds.
So-
We have POs.
But flood control levies? There are flood control levies on Sauvie Island, which we haven't explicitly included in this governance conversation. So Sauvie Island is a variable that could come in or not come in. Other than Sauvie Island and the Columbia Corridor, I don't believe there are any, flood control levies in the
There are flood control
metro area.
issues.
Yes.
Johnson Creek, waterfront.
Right, but those are addressed.
And so if you were going to go countywide, metro-wide, port-wide, you'd have to be able to clearly identify to the public why this area is a regional concern, whereas Johnson Creek or Fano Creek or Sauvie Island is not necessarily a regional concern.
Well, we'll just ask them how many times they've flown in the last year.
Right, and so it has to be about transportation infrastructure and it has to be about industrial lands for the metro area. You're going to have a hard time.
That's why I asked him to write what is our problem statement up there, because that's really part, when you get, whether we're talking about tax or whatever we're talking about, it's selling it to people. And what is a problem? You made passing reference to all the projects you can't afford to do. I mean, that's sort of the first I've heard that discussed in any of this. So what is our problem statement? We don't have to do it right now, but it definitely ties into whatever kind of strategy you're going to use with whatever audience. It's got to be something they care marginally about.
Go ahead, Kevin.
In the for what it's worth category, this benefits question is what we're trying to argue when we look for the New Start study from a national perspective. We're trying to make the argument that this levy system has national significance. And that's the argument we're trying to make. And we've come close a couple times to include this last time. So in the for what it's worth category.
So do we think then that Metro, from a political perspective, is red, orange, yellow, green?
I guess the question to me is, it depends a bit on what kind of funding mechanism we're asking for. And I think the question maybe is better stated as, what would it take for that to not be red?
Can Metro create a utility?
We don't think so
I'm
under the current
reasonably
law.
sure that under the charter, we could create a utility require a charter change, which would mean we go out to the voters for a charter change. That would be a heavy lift, to say the least, and something that would be totally unacceptable to the council.
Right, and I would imagine even if the council would want to, they'd want to talk with
They'd want a lot of
Ray and
folks.
Nolan and the
Right.
22 other cities,
Yep.
and how
3 counties.
how open are those 24 other cities going to be to a charter change?
Yep.
So if
Yeah,
there
so
is,
Michael is absolutely right. It's a regional problem. You need to deal with a large organization. But the political goodwill that people in East County have for Metro is not really high right now. Even though it's made for this kind of thing, I'm not sure it's going to be as easy. Selling is right. It is a selling, because I had a council member come to the meeting in February, and he came away going, crap, we really do need a solution, regional solution to the levy issue, because it impacts so many people and so much dollar value. So it's the selling which will make any of these things politically green.
Steve?
Just from a practical standpoint, not all these solutions require going out for a vote. It seems like there's got to be a differentiation between those that do and those that don't. Those that some of the utility models don't, so I see why they're orange. I don't know that a solution that requires a vote should be rated the same. Just
Well, and you have to ask a question like, which is easier, to get the public to vote for it or get the legislature to vote for it? And how do you evaluate which is the greener or redder of the two? And it comes back to what's the value proposition?
Legislature won't create it without a vote.
Legislature won't.
They'll create it and refer it.
Refer it, yeah.
For a vote of
Or vote
whatever.
inside the district, wherever it is.
Which then comes back to the value proposition. How can you sell it?
I think that we're wrapping ourselves around the axle by focusing on the political viability so much. I mean, I think you're going to end up putting red or orange along the whole bottom. So then what do you do? I mean, yeah, they're all hard, and we all know they're hard. So is this really the best? I don't know. Is the best way to move this forward or not?
I guess my concern about Metro is that the utility piece requires a charter change, so that's not an option in looking at Metro as the player. And then you're looking at the regional property tax piece.
Can we ask for rulings from council on whether or not?
I'll follow up,
they
but I'm pretty
run
sure.
a utility because they run a zoo, they run a
Let
garbage.
me
I think they have the authority to do
Convention
anything
center.
of regional concerns.
Sort of
With
subsidiary
approval.
as subsidiary corporations.
Let me
to other
I'll
corporations.
put a ping.
And so whether adding this is another
I do
one
not
of
think.
those. Like the lawyers are asking them to anticipate that.
I have a feeling that will not solve the question
We need
today.
some more research for that.
If we put a question mark with orange and red around it, I think we could probably continue on with the conversation and not.
Yep.
I would agree. I'd say, so the short answer, and getting back to your binary choices, if we're saying anything that requires a vote is red, and basically we're saying everything that's a utility model is an orange. So if a utility model exists, if there's a path to that, it would be an orange, and it would be a red if it were a vote. I think that's what
Property tax.
right.
That's a good
Yeah.
solution.
Does that work?
But,
Yeah.
and the challenge is red should be defined as no go.
Right.
And a vote doesn't mean no go, right? A vote means we make our best shot at it and we try to convince people that they should agree with the model we're talking about. And so going to Stephanie's point and Reed's suggestion, if we do some red and orange question marks and we move on for now.
Yep.
Okay?
I
So,
feel like I had this discussion between you and David like 10 years ago.
Probably several times.
Well,
Several
yeah,
times.
well,
These are not, these are political questions
Yes.
that can't be
answered in this
answered by the people